An old man kneels at an open window, and he already knows it will cost him his life. Below, in the streets of Babylon, his enemies are counting. They have studied him for years and found only one weakness, that 3 times a day, without fail, he prays. So, they made prayer a crime. The decree is signed, the trap is set. All he has to do is close the window. Instead, he opens it wider. By nightfall, soldiers will drag him to a pit of lions and seal a stone over the dark. And the king who signed his death will not sleep. But to understand why one man would rather face the lions than bend his knee to a king, you have to go back 60 years, to a boy taken from a burning city, and to a fire that could not touch 3 men who would not bow. Over the next hour, this is the complete story of Daniel. 60 years earlier, the world had an edge, and Jerusalem sat close to it. To the south lay Egypt, the empire everyone had always feared. To the northeast, along the 2 great rivers, something newer and hungrier was rising, Babylon. And a small kingdom like Judah survived only by guessing right about which giant to lean on. For years, Judah's kings had leaned toward Egypt. It was the wrong guess. In the spring of the year we would call 605 before Christ, a Babylonian prince named Nebuchadnezzar met the armies of Egypt at a river town called Carchemish. When the dust settled, Egypt was broken, and the map of the ancient world had been redrawn in a single afternoon. There was no power left between Babylon and the sea, and that meant there was no power left to protect Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar came south the way conquerors always came, not in rage, but in arithmetic. He did not need to burn the city, not yet. He needed it to kneel. King Jehoiakim of Judah, who had gambled everything on Egypt, now watched Egypt's shadow disappear from his borders, and he understood the terms without being told. He would pay. He would send tribute of gold from the temple treasury, and he would send something worth more than gold. He would send his children, not his own sons only, the children of Judah's finest houses, the royal line, the nobility, boys on the edge of manhood, chosen for a specific and chilling set of qualities. Listen to how the record describes the order. The king of Babylon commanded his chief official to bring young men of Israel, of royal blood and of noble birth, not the weak, not the expendable. He wanted the ones without physical defect, handsome, quick to learn, filled with knowledge, able to understand, fit to stand in a palace. He wanted the best a nation had, because you do not conquer a people by taking their weakest. You conquer them by taking their future. And so, in a city that had not yet burned, but already knew it was living on borrowed years, families said goodbye to their brightest sons, knowing they would walk hundreds of miles to a foreign capital and never come home. Among them was a boy named Daniel. We do not know his exact age. The record calls him and his companions youths, most likely somewhere in their teens, old enough to remember the taste of home, young enough to be reshaped. With him were 3 others from Judah, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. 4 boys, 4 names that meant something in Hebrew. Each one carried the name of the God of Israel folded inside it. Daniel, God is my judge. Hananiah, the Lord is gracious. Mishael, who is like God. Azariah, the Lord helps. Remember those names, because Babylon was about to take them. Picture the road. It ran for the better part of 1,000 miles, arcing north and then east to follow the rivers because the desert in between could not be crossed. Weeks of walking, the green hills of Judah giving way to scrubland, then to the flat, endless glare of Mesopotamia. And at the end of it, a city that made Jerusalem look like a village. Babylon was, by the measure of its age, the greatest city on earth. Walls so wide the ancient world told stories about them. A river running through the center, temples stacked toward the sky like man-made mountains, gates glazed in blue and gold. For a boy raised in the modest hill country capital of a defeated people, the first sight of Babylon must have done exactly what it was built to do. It must have made him feel small. It must have made him feel that his God had been left behind, back in the hills, in a temple that no longer had the gold to pay a foreign king. That was the whole idea. Everything about Babylon was designed to send one message to the boys walking through its gates. Your world is over. This is the real one now. And it was inside that message, that overwhelming gold-plated certainty, that 4 teenagers from a broken kingdom would have to decide who they still were. Babylon did not conquer these boys with chains. It conquered them with kindness. There were no dungeons for Daniel and his friends, no forced labor. Instead, there was a school, one of the finest in the ancient world. For 3 years, they would be taught the language of the Babylonians, their literature, their sciences, the movements of the stars, the reading of omens. They would eat from the king's own table. They would drink the king's own wine. They would be groomed, educated, and elevated until one day they could stand in the presence of Nebuchadnezzar himself and serve an empire. It was, in its way, a golden cage. And a golden cage is far more dangerous than an iron one, because you can forget you are inside it. The first thing the empire took was their names. The boy called God is my judge was renamed Belshazzar, a name that carried the name of Bel, the chief god of Babylon. Years later, the king himself would say it plainly. He was named after the king's god. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were given new names too, each one trading the God of Israel for a god of Babylon. It was not cruelty. It was strategy. Rename a people, and in a generation, they forget who they were. Take away the word for home, and eventually they stop trying to go back. And here is what makes Daniel remarkable. Remarkable enough that we would still be telling his story 26 centuries later. He let them take the name. He learned the language. He studied the literature of a pagan empire, mastered its sciences, absorbed its wisdom. He did not stage a rebellion over any of it. Daniel understood something that many people never learn, that you can live inside a system without belonging to it, that you can serve a king without worshiping him. He would give Babylon his mind. He would give Babylon his work. He would even answer to a Babylonian name. But there was a line, and the line was not where anyone would have expected it. The line was dinner. The king's food, rich meat, fine wine, the best a royal kitchen could produce, arrived daily for the young trainees. And Daniel resolved, the text says, that he would not defile himself with it, not because the food was poison, because to eat fully at the king's table on the king's terms was to be quietly absorbed, to accept that Babylon now owned even his appetite. So he asked for something almost comical in its humility: vegetables and water. The official in charge was terrified. If these four grew thin and pale, while the other trainees flourished, it was his head on the block. So Daniel proposed a test, the first of many tests in this story. Give us 10 days, feed us vegetables and water, then compare us to the young men who eat the king's food, and judge for yourself. 10 days, it is such a small, strange hill to plant a flag on. Not the names, not the language, not the pagan curriculum. Dinner. But that is exactly the point. Daniel understood that a person is not usually lost in one great betrayal. A person is lost slowly, one comfortable compromise at a time, each one so small it seems foolish to resist. And so he drew his line early, and he drew it small, on purpose. Because the man who will not bend on the small thing has already decided who he will be when the large thing comes. At the end of 10 days, the 4 boys who ate vegetables looked healthier than all the rest. It is easy to read past that moment, but hold on to it, because everything that follows, the dreams, the fire, the writing on the wall, the lions, all of it grows from a habit formed here, in a training hall, over a plate of vegetables. The habit of deciding in advance and in private that there are things you will not do, no matter who is watching and no matter what it costs. Daniel was a young man now, trusted, rising, fluent in the ways of the most powerful court on earth. And the court was about to have a very bad night. The trap, when it came, had nothing to do with vegetables. It was the king's sleep. Nebuchadnezzar was a young ruler now, sitting on the most powerful throne on earth, and something was eating at him from the inside. He began to have dreams. One dream in particular that came back and would not let him rest. He woke in the night with his spirit troubled, gripped by the certainty that the dream meant something enormous, and by the terror that he could not hold on to it. So he did what kings do. He summoned his experts. Babylon employed an entire class of professional wise men: magicians, enchanters, astrologers, diviners, men whose whole purpose was to read the will of the gods in the stars, in oil, on water, in the livers of animals. The king brought them in and gave them their task. Tell me what my dream means. And they said, of course, what such men always say. O king, live forever. Tell us the dream, and we will interpret it. That is when Nebuchadnezzar did something that turned an ordinary night into a death sentence for dozens of men. He refused. He would not tell them the dream. If they truly spoke for the gods, he reasoned, then let them prove it. Let them tell him the dream and its meaning both. It was an impossible demand, and everyone in the room knew it. The wise men said as much, and in doing so they said the truest thing any of them would ever say. There is no one on earth who can do this. Only the gods could reveal such a thing, and the gods do not live among men. It was the wrong answer to give a frightened, furious king. Nebuchadnezzar exploded. He ordered the execution of every wise man in Babylon. Every one. And here is the detail that turns this from a palace tantrum into Daniel's crisis. The decree did not distinguish between the astrologers who had failed and the young trainees who had never even been in the room, all the wise men of Babylon. That category now included 4 young men from Judah who had done nothing but study, and eat their vegetables. Somewhere across the city, a captain of the king's guard began drawing up his list of names. And on that list were 4 men who worshipped the God of Israel. The soldiers were already moving through the streets. Picture it. Daniel is in his quarters, perhaps at his studies, perhaps at his prayers. There is a knock or the sound of boots, and a man named Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, the man tasked with the killing, has come to collect him. This is the lowest point of the first act of Daniel's life. A boy torn from a burning homeland, marched 1,000 miles, stripped of his name, and now, through no fault of his own, for a dream he never had, and a failure that was not his, condemned to die. He is young, he is powerless, he has no army, no rank, no leverage. Everything the empire has done to him has led to this corridor, this soldier, this sentence. And watch what he does. He does not beg, he does not run, he does not curse the king or the God who let him end up here. He asks a question, quietly, with what the text calls wisdom and tact. He turns to the executioner and asks, "Why is the king's decree so urgent?" It is the calm of a man who decided years ago over a plate of vegetables who he was going to be when the worst arrived. The habit of the small no has become the steadiness of the great crisis. Arioch explains, and Daniel makes a request that should have been impossible for a condemned foreigner to make. "Give me time, and I will tell the king his dream." Then he goes home to 3 friends, and he tells them there is only one thing left to do: not fight, not flee, pray. 4 young men prayed through the night, not for rescue in some vague, comforting sense, for their lives, measured now in hours. Somewhere in the palace, the executions had perhaps already begun, and in a rented house in the greatest city on earth, 4 exiles asked the God of their fathers, the God they had refused to trade away even when Babylon renamed them, to show mercy and to reveal a secret no living man could know. And in the night, the text says, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Notice what he does first. He does not run to the king. He does not run to save himself. He stops, and he blesses God. Wisdom and power belong to him. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. Even here, with the sword still hanging over him, the first thing out of Daniel is gratitude. Then, and only then, he goes to find the executioner. "Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon," he tells Arioch. "Take me to the king." Imagine the scene in the throne room. A young foreigner, barely out of his training, standing before the most powerful man alive. A man who has just ordered mass execution over this very matter. Nebuchadnezzar looks at him and asks the impossible question, "Are you able to tell me what I saw and what it means?" And Daniel's answer is the hinge of the entire story. Because he could have taken the credit. He could have played the role of the brilliant sage, the one wise man who succeeded where all the others failed. Instead, he does the opposite. No wise man, no enchanter, no magician can explain this to the king, he says. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He gives the glory away before he says a single word of the dream. In a court built entirely on flattering the king and elevating oneself, Daniel points past himself and past the king to someone higher than both. Then he tells Nebuchadnezzar his own dream. "You saw a great statue," Daniel says. Enormous, dazzling, terrifying. Its head was gold. Its chest and arms were silver. Its belly and thighs, bronze. Its legs were iron, and its feet were iron mixed with clay. You can imagine the king going pale, because this is the thing he could not hold on to when he woke. The image that had been eating at his sleep, now spoken back to him by a stranger. And then, Daniel continues, a stone cut from a mountain by no human hand. It struck the statue at its feet, and the whole thing shattered. Gold, silver, bronze, iron, clay, all of it crushed to dust and blown away like chaff in the wind. But the stone grew into a mountain until it filled the whole earth. The meaning, Daniel explains, is a message about time itself. The golden head is Nebuchadnezzar, his empire, his glory. But after him will come another kingdom, and another, and another, each one giving way to the next, all of them temporary, all of them destined to be blown away. And in the end, a kingdom not built by human hands, one that will never be destroyed and will never pass to another people. Sit with what that means in that room. Daniel is standing before a king who believes himself eternal in a city built to feel permanent, and he is saying, gently, but without flinching, even this will pass. Even Babylon, everything human ends. Only what God builds lasts. It is the boldest thing anyone could say to Nebuchadnezzar, and the king's response is astonishing. He does not rage. He falls on his face before a Judean captive. He calls Daniel's God the God of gods, the revealer of mysteries, and he raises the young exile to rule over the entire province of Babylon. The condemned foreigner is now one of the most powerful men in the empire. It should be the end of the danger. It is only the beginning. Years passed, and somewhere along the way, Nebuchadnezzar forgot the lesson. He had knelt before a Judean captive and called his God the God of gods. He had heard with his own ears that his golden empire would one day be blown away like chaff. And then, because this is what power does to a man, he decided to answer that prophecy with defiance. He built a statue, not of many metals this time, all gold, 60 cubits high, 90 feet of gleaming metal rising off the flat plain of Dura, visible for miles under the Mesopotamian sun. If Daniel's God had shown him a statue with a golden head that gave way to lesser kingdoms, Nebuchadnezzar would build one that was gold from crown to foot. No silver, no bronze, no iron and clay. My kingdom does not end. Then he summoned every official in the empire, satraps, governors, judges, treasurers, and gave a simple command. When the music played, every knee would bend to the golden image, and anyone who refused would be thrown that same hour into a blazing furnace. You already know 3 men who would not bend: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the boys once called Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Daniel's friends from the training hall, now grown men and officials of the province. When the horns and harps sounded, and a whole plain of people fell to the ground like wheat before wind, 3 men stayed standing. They did not make a speech. They did not have to. In a sea of bowed backs, 3 upright figures are the loudest thing on the plain. The informants ran to the king at once, and Nebuchadnezzar, who had once honored their God, flew into a rage. He gave them one more chance, almost pleading, almost threatening. When the music plays again, bow. And if you will not, what God can save you from my hand? Their answer is one of the most extraordinary things any human being has ever said to a tyrant. Listen closely. "O king," they said, "we do not need to defend ourselves. If we are thrown into the furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us, and he will deliver us from your hand." They could have stopped there. It would already have been bold. But they did not stop there. They added 5 words that change everything. "But if not, even if he does not, we still will not serve your gods or worship the image you have set up." But if not. Understand what those 3 men just did. They did not bargain with God for rescue. They did not say, "Save us and we will trust you." They said the opposite. "Whether or not you save us, our answer is the same. We do not obey because it pays. We obey because you are God." That is the fire the title of this film is named for. Not the flames on the plain of Dura. The fire inside 3 men who had decided that faithfulness was not a transaction. Nebuchadnezzar lost himself. He ordered the furnace stoked 7 times hotter. So hot that when the strongest soldiers in his army carried the 3 men to the mouth of it, the heat killed the soldiers where they stood, and the 3, bound hand and foot, fell into the flames. Then the king rose from his throne, staring, and his voice went strange. "Did we not throw 3 men into the fire?" "3, O king, then why do I see 4 walking? Loose, unharmed, and the fourth looks like a son of the gods." He called them out by name. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego walked out of a furnace that had killed the men who carried them. Not scorched, not singed, their clothes not even smelling of smoke. Whatever else the fire proved, it proved this: they had been right not to bargain. The God who was able had chosen this time to deliver, but their faith had never depended on the outcome. It had already passed through the fire before the fire was ever lit. Here, the story does something no other ancient record does. It hands the pen to the king. Daniel chapter 4 is not written about Nebuchadnezzar, it is written by him. A royal proclamation sent out to every nation under his rule, in which the most powerful man on earth confesses the most humiliating thing that ever happened to him. Kings carve their victories into stone. This king published his breakdown. And to understand why, you have to follow him down. It began, as it always did with him, with a dream. He was at rest in his palace, prosperous, secure, and a vision came in the night that filled him with dread. He saw a tree, enormous. Its top touched the sky, its branches reached the ends of the earth, and every creature alive found shelter and food beneath it. And then a holy messenger came down from heaven and gave a terrible command: cut it down, strip its branches, but leave the stump in the ground, bound with iron and bronze, and let the heart of a man become the heart of a beast, until 7 times pass over him. Daniel was summoned, and when he understood the dream, the text tells us something tender. He was troubled. He stood silent, alarmed. This was the king who had once spared his life, raised him up, honored his God. Daniel did not want to say what he had to say. "My lord," he finally told him, "if only this dream were for your enemies and not for you." The tree was Nebuchadnezzar. The greatness was real, and the fall was coming. But Daniel did not simply deliver a sentence. He offered a door. "Break off your sins," he pleaded. "Do what is right. Show mercy to the oppressed. It may be that your peace will continue." Even in prophesying the king's downfall, the man of God was reaching out a hand. Nebuchadnezzar had 12 months to walk through that door. He didn't. A full year later, he was walking on the roof of his palace, looking out over the greatest city in the world, the hanging gardens, the blue and gold gates, the temples climbing toward heaven, and pride rose up in him one final time. "Is this not great Babylon," he said, "which I have built by my mighty power for the glory of my majesty? I built my power, my glory." The words were still in his mouth when a voice came from heaven, and in that same hour, the mind of the most powerful man on earth left him. The text describes it with a strange, merciful restraint. He was driven from among people. He lived in the open, like an animal. He ate grass. The dew of heaven soaked him through the nights. His hair grew matted and long, his nails uncut and curling. The king who had ruled the world could no longer rule himself. Everything he had said, I built my power, my glory, was gone, and he could not lift a finger to get it back. Now stand back and see what this chapter is really doing in a film about Daniel. Daniel is barely in it. He appears, interprets, pleads, and then steps aside and lets the story make its own point. Because the whole book has been building one argument, and here it is, proven on the body of the king himself. The Most High rules over the kingdoms of men and gives them to whomever he will. Not Nebuchadnezzar, not Babylon. The gold head bows after all. And then, grace. At the end of the appointed time, the king says, I lifted my eyes to heaven, not to his throne, not to his city, to heaven. And his sanity returned to him. The first thing his restored mind did was bless the God he had spent a lifetime resisting. The proudest man in the ancient world ended his own royal proclamation with a warning to everyone who would ever read it. Those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. He had learned it the hardest way a man can learn anything. The kings who came after him would not learn it at all. Decades passed. Nebuchadnezzar died, and the throne of Babylon eventually passed through a handful of short-lived kings to a man who had learned nothing from any of them. His name was Belshazzar, a ruler who looked back on the great Nebuchadnezzar as his father. And on the night this story remembers him, the Medes and the Persians were already at the walls of the city. An army camped outside the greatest fortifications in the world. Belshazzar's answer to a siege was to throw a party. 1,000 of his nobles filled the great hall. Wine ran freely. And somewhere in the haze of it, the king had an idea that would end his life. He remembered the treasure his people had carried back from a conquered temple in a distant hill country capital. The gold and silver vessels taken from the house of the God of Israel decades before, when Jerusalem finally fell. Bring them, he ordered. We'll drink from those. Understand what this was. These were not just cups. They were the sacred vessels of worship, made holy for one purpose, and Belshazzar had them filled with wine so that he and his nobles and his wives could toast. The text is precise about this. The gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. He was not merely being reckless. He was staging a deliberate insult to the living God, using his own holy things to honor dead idols. That is the moment the fingers appeared. A human hand, just the hand, writing on the plaster of the palace wall, lit by the lampstand, in full view of 1,000 people. The music stopped. The laughter died. And the king who had felt untouchable a moment before went white, his knees knocked together. The text does not exaggerate his terror. It lingers on it because this is a man watching judgment write itself into his own wall. 4 words stood on the plaster, and no one in Babylon could read them. The wise men were summoned, the same guild generations on, and just as useless as they had been the night of Nebuchadnezzar's first dream. They could not read it, or dared not. And then the Queen Mother remembered an old man. There was one, she said, from the days of Nebuchadnezzar, a man in whom was the spirit of the holy gods, who had solved every mystery the wise men could not. Send for Daniel. Daniel is old now. He has served empires, buried a king, watched a dynasty curdle into this drunken boy. And when they bring him in and promise him purple robes and gold chains and the 3rd place in the kingdom, he does something that tells you everything about how the years have shaped him. He waves the rewards away. Keep your gifts, he says. Give them to someone else. I will still read the writing. He has nothing left to gain from any king. He answers to a higher one. Then he speaks to Belshazzar the way no one else in that hall could. He reminds him of the great king before him, of Nebuchadnezzar's pride and his madness and his hard-won humility. You knew all this, Daniel says. You knew what happened to him, and still you lifted yourself against the Lord of heaven. You drank from his vessels and praised gods that cannot see or hear, and the God who holds your very breath in his hand. Him you did not honor. And then he reads the wall. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. They were words of measurement, weights, a merchant's terms, and that was part of the mystery, because as nouns they made no sense on a palace wall. But Daniel heard the verbs hidden inside them. Mene, numbered. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, weighed. You have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Paris, divided. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Numbered, weighed, divided. A whole empire's obituary in 3 words on a wall. Belshazzar kept his promise. They clothed the old man in purple and hung the gold chain around his neck and proclaimed him 3rd in the kingdom. It was the shortest promotion in history. That very night, the writing came true. The city fell, and Belshazzar the king was killed before morning. Babylon fell in a single night, and Daniel did not fall with it. This is the quiet marvel that opens the final act. An old man who had risen under Nebuchadnezzar survived the madness of one king and the arrogance of another, watched an entire empire collapse around him. And when the Medes and Persians took the city, they looked at this aging Judean administrator and did the same thing every regime before them had done. They promoted him. King Darius reorganized his new empire into 120 provinces, each with its own satrap, and set 3 high officials over them all to keep the satraps honest. Daniel was one of the 3, and he so outshone the rest, the text says an excellent spirit was in him, that the king began planning to set him over the entire kingdom, a foreigner, a captive, a man now well past 80, in his 3rd empire, about to become the 2nd most powerful person in the Persian world. And that is exactly what could not be allowed to happen. The other officials were consumed with jealousy. They set out to find something, anything, they could use to destroy him. They dug through his administration, looking for corruption, for negligence, for a single misused coin. And they found nothing. The text is almost admiring. He was faithful, and no error or fault could be found in him. Think about what that means. After 60 years inside the machinery of pagan power, handling the wealth of empires, there was not one thread to pull. So they said to each other the sentence that is the whole story in miniature. We will never find anything against this man, unless it has something to do with the law of his God. They had studied him. They knew his life ran on a rhythm as fixed as sunrise. 3 times a day, at his upper window that opened toward a ruined city 1,000 miles away, the old man knelt and prayed to the God of Israel. He had done it as a young official under Nebuchadnezzar. He was doing it still. It was the most predictable thing about him. And they decided to turn the most faithful habit of his life into the instrument of his death. They went to Darius with flattery dressed as governance. O king, live forever. Let a law be made that for 30 days no one may pray to any god or any man except to you, and whoever breaks it is thrown to the lions. They fed the king's vanity, told him all his officials had agreed on it. A lie, because the one official who mattered had never been asked. And then they closed the trap with a detail Darius could not undo. Sign it, they said, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be changed. It was the fatal genius of the plan. In the Persian world, a king's signed decree was irrevocable. Not even the king who wrote it could take it back. Darius, flattered and careless, signed his own friend's death warrant and did not realize it until it was far too late. Now, watch the old man. Daniel learns that the document has been signed. He knows exactly what it means and exactly who it is aimed at. He knows the windows of his upper room face the street. He knows they will be watching. He has every reason and every excuse to pray quietly behind a closed shutter just for 30 days. God would surely understand. No one would even have to know. He goes home, he climbs the stairs, and he opens the windows toward Jerusalem the way he always has. And he kneels 3 times that day and prays and gives thanks before his God, just as he has done since he was a young man, in a training hall, who would not eat from a king's table. He does not add a word of protest. He does not change a thing. He simply keeps being who he has always been, out loud, in the open, where they can see. Down in the street, his enemies are already counting, and the trap closes on an old man at an open window. They caught him, of course. That was the whole point. The conspirators had only to wait beneath his window, and there he was, kneeling, praying aloud, giving thanks to the God of Israel, exactly as the law now forbade. They had their evidence. They went straight to the king. But first, they made Darius trap himself again. Did you not sign a decree, they asked, that anyone who prays to any god or man but you for 30 days is thrown to the lions? The king, not yet seeing where this was going, confirmed it. The thing stands by the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be changed. Only then did they spring it. Daniel, that man from the exiles of Judah, pays no attention to you or your decree. He prays 3 times a day, and the record shows us something remarkable about Darius in that instant. He was not angry at Daniel. He was furious with himself. The text says the king was deeply distressed, and he set his heart on saving Daniel, and he labored until sundown looking for any way out. He had been used. He saw it now, the flattery, the trap, the friend he had signed away. He turned the law over and over in his hands, looking for a seam, and there was none. He had made it himself, and it would not bend even for the man who made it. As the sun went down, the conspirators returned, cold and patient, to remind him, the law cannot be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel, an old man now, past 80, who had served this empire, and the one before it, and the one before that. And they led him to the mouth of the pit. And Darius, who could not save him, said the only thing a helpless king could say, "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you." A stone was rolled over the mouth of the den, and the king pressed his own signet ring into the seal, and the rings of his nobles beside it, so that no one, not even the king in a moment of weakness, could open it before morning. Then the dark closed over Daniel, and a story that began 60 years ago with a boy taken from his home comes down at last to this: an old man sealed in a pit in the dark with the lions. Now the film splits into 2 rooms and holds them side by side. In the palace, the king does not eat. He sends away the musicians. He lies down and cannot sleep. The most powerful man in the world spends the whole night in the dark, tormented by a decree he cannot unmake, waiting for a dawn he dreads. In the pit, we are not told what Daniel does, but we know the man. We have watched him for 60 years, the boy who would not eat the king's food, the young man who blessed God before he interpreted a dream, the old man who would not close a window, and the silence of the den tells its own story. Whatever else was in that pit, panic was not. The one who spent his whole life on his knees was not likely to lose his peace in the one place he could do nothing but pray. First light, and the king is already running. He reaches the sealed stone, and his voice breaks the morning, not with faith, but with desperate hope. "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to save you from the lions?" Silence, and then from inside the pit, from the dark, an old man's voice. "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not touched me, because I was found innocent before him, and I have done no wrong before you either." The stone comes off. They lift him out, and when they bring him into the light, they find not a scratch on him. He had trusted his God, and the window he refused to close had not cost him his life after all. The rescue was not the end of the story. Justice was. The men who had engineered all of this, who had studied a righteous old man for the sole purpose of destroying him, who had twisted his most faithful habit into a capital crime, who had manipulated a king into signing away his own friend. Those men had made one fatal miscalculation. They had built a trap that could not be unbuilt. The law of the Medes and Persians could not be changed. And now that Daniel had walked out of the pit alive, that same unbending law turned in their hands. At the king's command, the accusers were brought to the very den they had prepared for another man, and the pit they had dug for Daniel received them instead. The text notes soberly that their families shared their fate, the ancient world's grim arithmetic of conspiracy, and the lions that had lain like lambs around an old man all night were lions again. There is an old truth buried in that reversal, and the scriptures state it plainly in other places. The one who digs a pit will fall into it. The trap that malice builds has a way of swallowing the builder. Then King Darius did something no one could have scripted. This pagan Persian monarch sat down and wrote a decree, not a local ordinance this time, but a proclamation to every nation, people, and language in all the earth. And listen to what he commanded them to do, not to worship him, to fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, Darius wrote, and he endures forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. Sit with the echo in those words, because we have heard them before at the very start of this story. A young Daniel once stood before Nebuchadnezzar and described a kingdom that would never be destroyed, a dominion that would outlast every golden empire. 60 years later, a completely different king of a completely different empire writes the same truth into imperial law, because he watched it walk out of a lion's den alive. The message Daniel interpreted as a young man, his own life had now become. If this story has held you this far, if you have felt the weight of a faith that would not bend across 60 years and 3 empires, then take a moment and subscribe. There is a new journey through Scripture here every week, and I would be honored to have you along for the next one. Because Daniel's story does not end at the pit. The old man simply went back to work. The text tells us, almost in passing, that Daniel prospered through the reign of Darius and on into the reign of Cyrus the Persian, the very king who, in that same season, would issue the decree that let the exiles of Judah go home. Think about what that means. Daniel had been carried to Babylon as a boy in the first wave of the exile. He had lived his entire adult life in a foreign land, serving foreign kings, praying every day toward a city he had not seen since childhood, a city that, for most of his life, lay in ruins. And he lived long enough to see the empire that destroyed Jerusalem fall, and to stand in the court of the king who would command it rebuilt. He never made the journey home himself. As far as we know, he died in Babylon, an old man far from the hills of Judah. But he had done something more lasting than return. He had spent 70 years proving in the throne rooms of the most powerful men on earth that you can lose your country, your name, your freedom, and your safety, and still not lose your God. Kings rose and fell around him like the metals of a shattered statue. Babylon became Persia. Nebuchadnezzar became Cyrus. And through all of it, one old exile kept opening his window toward home. So what do we do with a story like this, 26 centuries after the last lion went quiet? It is tempting to make Daniel a story about rescue, about a God who shuts the mouths of lions and pulls his people out of the fire at the last moment. And he did here. But if that is the lesson we carry home, we have missed the deepest thing this story has to say. Because for every Daniel who walked out of a pit, there were faithful men and women in that same exile who did not. The fire in the title of this film was never really the furnace on the plain of Dura. The fire was the thing inside 3 young men who said, "Our God is able to deliver us. But even if he does not, we will not bow. But if not." That is the center of gravity of this entire story. Daniel and his friends did not serve God because he was useful. They did not obey in order to be rescued. They obeyed because he was God. And whether the outcome was a furnace survived or a furnace endured, a pit opened or a pit sealed, their answer was already settled long before the crisis came. Faith, in this story, is not a lever you pull to get out of danger. It is who you have already decided to be when the danger arrives. And notice where that decision was actually made. Not on the plain of Dura, not at the mouth of the den. It was made years earlier, quietly, over a plate of vegetables in a training hall, by a boy who decided that there were lines he would not cross when no one important was even watching. Everything downstream, the dreams, the fire, the writing on the wall, the lions, grew from that first small, unglamorous no. That is the quiet challenge this old story lays at the feet of anyone who hears it. We tend to imagine that if the great test ever came, the furnace, the lions, the moment that costs everything, we would stand. But Daniel's life says the opposite. The man who stood before lions at 80 was formed by the boy who drew a line at dinner at 15. You do not rise to the level of your convictions in the crisis. You fall to the level of the habits you built in the ordinary days before it. Which brings us back to a window, an old man kneeling at an open window who already knew what it would cost him. He could have closed it. He could have prayed in secret for 30 days, and no one would have blamed him. But by then, opening that window was not a decision he had to make. It was simply who he was, the last faithful repetition of a habit 60 years deep. The window was open because it had always been open. He was not being brave in that moment. He was just being Daniel. One more time. The empires he served are dust now. Their golden statues, their sealed decrees, their unchangeable laws, all of it blown away like chaff on a threshing floor, exactly as a young exile once told a frightened king it would be. But the God he knelt toward, morning and noon and night, through 6 decades and 3 empires, and one very long night among the lions, that God, the story insists, endures forever. Kingdoms rise, kingdoms fall, and a faithful life just keeps opening the window. Which moment of this story spoke to you the most? The fire, the writing on the wall, or the old man who would not close his window? Tell me below, and tell me whose story we should tell next. Scripture explained, faith applied, life changed. This was your daily manna. Come hungry next week.